While we often learn about major events like wars and civil rights movements in a broader sense, there are tons of important stories that are either skimmed over or never talked about at all. These moments reveal the darker and sometimes stranger sides of American history. In March of 1932, a group of World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C. They were seeking immediate payment of a promised bonus for their service, money that wasn't set up to be paid until 1945. The thing is, the Great Depression had left people struggling. The movement started in Portland, Oregon, when about 400 veterans, led by Walter M. Waters, decided to trek to the capital. They rode freight trains and walked for weeks, and by June, there were around 1,500 veterans camped out in makeshift shantytowns. As more veterans arrived, their numbers reached between 10 and 20,000. Finally, on July 28th, Hoover ordered the U.S. Army to forcibly remove the marchers. Troops hit the veterans with tear gas, bayonets, and even tanks to clear them out. After the violence, Hoover doubled down and dismissed the marchers, saying he didn't even think most of them were genuine veterans. The Battle of Wounded Knee took place on December 29, 1890. Now, calling this a battle just isn't accurate, which is why it's often referred to now as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Nearly 300 Lakota people were killed by U.S. Army soldiers near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. Till this day, this is the deadliest mass shooting in American history. The attack was part of what the military called the Pine Ridge Campaign. At the time, there was a religious dance sweeping the plains known as the Ghost Dance. Now, I'm simplifying it a lot here, but in essence, there was a belief that practicing this ritual dance would protect them from the white settlers and return their land to the way it was. Some American government officials thought that the ghost dancers were militants, threatening to destroy the government's efforts to civilize the Lakota. The situation escalated when a band of Lakota led by Spotted Elk was approached by the U.S. 7th Cavalry. The army aimed to disarm them. A deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote hesitated to surrender his weapon, and when his firearm accidentally discharged, American soldiers began firing at the Lakota. As many as 300 Lakota were killed. 19 American soldiers then received medals of honor. In 1990, Congress expressed deep regret, and the site is now a National Historic Landmark. On July 14, 1877, the Great Railroad Strike erupted in Martinsburg, Virginia, when workers protested their third pay cut in a year. This would be the first national strike in the country's history, quickly spreading to Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Missouri. Workers disrupted rail operations, blocking tracks and halting trains, and then things got violent. On July 20th, Maryland National Guard troops confronted strikers in Baltimore, opening fire and killing 11 of them. Over the next few days, violence erupted in Pittsburgh as well, where state troops killed around 40 workers. Federal troops also hit strikers in St. Louis, leading to more deaths. By the end of it all, over 100 workers were killed across different cities. The Bayview Massacre is another dark chapter in American labor history. It all began on May 1st, 1886, when more than 200,000 workers across the country rallied for an 8-hour workday. Tensions were running high, and local business owners were getting more and more nervous. They urged Wisconsin Governor Jeremiah Rusk to send in the National Guard to try and restore order. By May 4th, around 250 guardsmen had been deployed to the scene. Strikers began throwing rocks and shouting at the soldiers. The guardsmen fired warning shots over the crowd, but they still weren't going anywhere. Governor Rusk ordered them to take a more aggressive action, and the next day, as the strikers gathered again to demand their rights, the order was given to just fire directly into the crowd. 15 people were killed, including a retired man and a youth who'd joined in with the protest. This basically put an end to the strike, and it would be years until the 8-hour workday was finally implemented. Alright, so this list has been incredibly dark, so just for a bit of a breather, let's talk baseball for a minute. One of the biggest sports in the USA. Some would even say it beats out football as the quintessential American sport, but you Americans will have to tell me your thoughts on that down in the comments. In 1919, the image of baseball was tainted by one of the worst scandals in sports history. During the 1919 World Series, the Chicago White Sox were favored to beat the Cincinnati Reds, but to everyone's shock, the Sox lost. It seemed odd, especially since they were such a strong team. Later, it came out out that several players had been paid off to throw the series. Why? Well, many players felt like they weren't being paid fairly for their talent. They were frustrated and just desperate for cash, which made them easy targets for gamblers looking to fix the games. The money was just too hard for them to turn down. Players thought they could get away with it, but once fans and reporters started noticing some really weird plays, the truth eventually came out. 8 players were banned from baseball for life. It was a scandal that made people question the integrity of the game itself. The Scopes trial, often called the Monkey Trial, took place in July of 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. It's one of the wildest trials in American history. A high school teacher named John T. Scopes had been charged with breaking a state law called the Butler Act. The law made it illegal to teach Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools, insisting instead on the biblical account of creation. Trial quickly turned into this national spectacle. The prosecution was led by William Jennings Bryan, a staunch advocate for the literal interpretation of the Bible. On the other side was Clarence Darrow, a famous defense attorney with more progressive views. On the surface, the trial was about a high school teacher refusing to adhere to a new law, but this was really much bigger than that. This was a cultural battle. When the trial began, it quickly became clear that the judge, John Ralston, was determined to keep the proceedings as focused as possible solely on whether Scopes had actually taught evolution, which he had. Darrow attempted to introduce expert testimonies and argue about the law's constitutionality, but Ralston ruled these out. The most dramatic moment is probably when Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible, and their exchange was pretty intense. Darrow questioned the literal interpretation of various biblical stories. In the end, Scopes was found guilty, and he was fined $100. But the Scopes trial left a lasting impact on the country. Tennessee banned the teaching of evolution in schools until 1967. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is one of those strange disasters that seems almost surreal. On January 15th, 1919, a massive storage tank in Boston, Massachusetts burst, releasing this giant wave of molasses rushing through the streets. The tank held about 2.3 million gallons of molasses. As the thick brown syrup poured out, it engulfed everything in its path. Buildings were knocked off the foundations, people were swept away. I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but it would have been absolutely horrific, and it was. 21 people lost their lives, even more were injured. In some places, the molasses layer afterwards was so thick that it was almost impossible to walk through. The tank had been poorly constructed, and people were furious, saying that the United States Industrial Alcohol should have been held accountable for the disaster. And it really just goes to show that something as mundane as molasses, if not handled properly, can be absolutely disastrous. The Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, Missouri is often dubbed one of the most haunted places in America. Yes, I had to throw a haunting in there. Built in 1890, the mansion was home to the Lemp family, who founded the Lemp Brewing Company. At its peak, the brewery was one of the largest in the country, but the mansion is probably most infamous for the deaths of multiple members of the family, 3 of which took their own lives in the home. William Lemp Sr. took his own life in the mansion's attic in 1904, following the death of his 4th son. William Lemp Jr. took his life in 1922, and in 1949, Charles Lemp ended his life. The mansion then became a boarding house in 1950, but rumors about the place being haunted by members of the Lemp family began to spread. And over the years, people have reported feeling an unsettling presence in the house, along with strange noises and even sightings of apparitions. Today, the mansion operates as a restaurant and inn, but people still do ghost hunts. The mansion has been featured in an episode of Ghost Hunters and Living for the Dead in 2023. The Radium Girls. Back in the 1920s, these young women worked in factories painting watch dials with radium paint, which would make the dials glow in the dark. The women were told to use their lips to shape their paintbrushes, which meant they were swallowing tiny amounts of radium every single day without realizing it. At first, a lot of them were fine, but as time went on, they started to experience health issues like jaw necrosis. That's where the bones in the jaw start to decay. It was terrifying, but even as they got sick, doctors and employees just shrugged it off or just didn't know what was happening. A group of these women decided enough was enough, though. They took their fight to court, determined to hold their employers accountable. Because of them, national attention was brought to workplace safety, or the lack thereof, and eventually important important changes were made in labor laws and safety regulations. The New London School explosion occurred on March 18, 1937. It's one of the deadliest disasters in Texas's history, but it's not really talked about that much. What happened is that a natural gas leak caused this massive explosion, killing nearly 300 students and teachers at the London School in New London, Texas. On that day, a lot of the students had been let out early for a competition, thankfully, but about 500 stayed in the main building. Just before 3:17 p.m., an instructor turned on an electric sander, which sparked the gas-air mixture that had built up in the school. Witnesses reported that the walls bulged, the roof lifted, and then crashed back down, completely collapsing the structure. The explosion was so powerful that it could apparently be heard 4 miles away, and debris was thrown hundreds of feet, with lockers flying through the air. Parents and locals desperately dug through the rubble with their bare hands to find survivors. Rescuers included doctors, nurses, Boy Scouts. They worked through the night. Nearly 294 people were confirmed dead. Again, as time has gone on though, this incident has kind of faded into obscurity, and maybe that makes sense. According to locals, there seemed to be this collective silence about the event in the years that passed, when it was discussed in hushed tones. But there's no doubt that the tragedy still haunts New London. With all that said, I've been your host James. I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.